Okay, cool. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Justice and Social Transformation. I'd like to welcome our moderator, Dr. David Hart, to get the session started. Following the session, we will have Q&A.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. It's a great pleasure to be able to moderate this panel. We have two fascinating books that are quite different, but interestingly related in a number of ways. I'm joined by one of our professors of anthropology, Ronald Reason, who is an expert on human rights and international law, and who has written a book titled The Memory Seeker, which is are these available for these
Yes,
books? Can I say that? Which is available for purchase now, and which is a work of fiction, which we'll talk a little bit about. I'm also joined by Dr. Sarah Federman, who is a professor, an associate professor in the Kroc School of Peace Studies, and who will be presenting her book on transformative negotiations. And this is apparently the first time they've ever written and presented books separately. Dr. Federman and Dr. Reason are connected. They are a couple, and so this is going to be very interesting. They've written two very unique and different books, but they have a long history of working together on books looking at international negotiations and negotiations, particularly dealing with indigenous people in, is it fair to say Northern Africa? Is that or in
West Africa.
West Africa, yes. And this exploration will look at two of their sort of separate pieces. I'm going to start by asking each of them to talk a little bit about the books that they've written, which again I found quite fascinating because of how different they are. And then we're going to go into a little bit more detail in understanding how these books came about and sort of what impact their written books will have. So I'll start with Dr. Neeson, because first of all, I want to say I am not a fan of fiction. I do not normally read fiction, but I enjoyed reading Dr. Neeson's book, The Memory Seeker, which is a fascinating look at the the main character happens to also be an anthropologist.
How did that happen?
I'm not sure how that happened. But an investigator working at The Hague, trying to investigate war crimes in the West African state of Mali, and who is also becomes involved in a journey of personal or family exploration around the same subject matter.
Right.
And so I'm really curious. Can you tell us more about how this book came about?
Well, there were two basic things that pushed me in that direction, aside from the long-standing fascination with literature and writing. One was the frustration that I had in trying to do fieldwork in the International Criminal Court in The Hague through the COVID closure. So I wasn't able to go there at the time that I had a leave to do the writing. So I thought, okay, well, I'll just write what I've got, and I don't have all the facts I need, so I'll write fiction. I'll fill the holes and build a plot around it. So where do I look for a plot? So to do that, I went to my family. My parents both survived the German occupation of the Netherlands during World War II, and my father was 20 years old at D-Day. And nobody in the family knew what he'd done during the war. And this even came up when I eventually went back to the Netherlands. I had an aunt who married into the family. She didn't know that I'd been working on this novel. And she said out of the blue, I never did know what your father did during the war. And he died a few years before I started writing. And so to answer that part of the question, what would an investigator be looking at in his own family background? I turned to that question. Like, what did my father do during the war? And it became, that irritation of not knowing and never being able to find out became the sort of mystery that drove the book, that drove the plot.
And that's a central question for war crimes investigators.
It
Right?
is.
Effectively, and the title is very apt, right? You're trying to recreate and understand, not recreate, but to revisit what's happened in the past, to bring what is known about the past, bring those memories to the present, in part to provide a remedy for what has happened, but also, as you point out in the book, to try to inflict that memory in some ways on society, so that we also become accountable for dealing with those kinds of traumatic events, horrific, genocidal events,
Right.
et cetera, and to grapple with them.
That's very true. It isn't just a family journey. It's a journey when you're looking at uncovering these war crimes, even if they're close, even if they're situated in family, pulling those out, painful as that might be, isn't just to serve as a lesson of justice either. It's not just for the courtroom, it's for society to understand what happened and how. And as one of the characters says in the book, so it doesn't happen again. We want to look at this closely. And the same thing is happening in Ukraine too, right? The same issues of struggling with memory and struggling with complicity and people not knowing, this will become more acute, of course, as time goes on. Was my father, was my parent complicit with the Russians? It happens in every major conflict.
We're struggling with memory in places like Florida.
Right.
Well, in the
Yes.
United States.
Yes.
So it's a pertinent question. But I also want to find out about Sarah's the impetus to write a book on negotiation, and a book that throughout really weaves. What I found most interesting about the book is it's really geared towards any reader. Right? It is not a sort of very academic treatment of negotiation, or even an purely empirical study of different negotiation tactics and the way things have worked. But it's really geared towards helping to identify some of the aspects of being in a negotiating situation, and understanding even some of the emotional aspects that come about as you're trying to deal with difficult situations. So can you tell us a little bit about how this book?
So I'm also obsessed with genocide and memory, like Ron, because we met on a genocide panel, and we're working on books together, but we didn't live in the same place. I was in Baltimore at the time, and I'd had a corporate career before I came to this work. Before living in Europe really brought me back to this work, and I had studied negotiation at Harvard and came to Baltimore, and they wanted me to teach negotiation. They're like, you've done business, you've studied negotiation at Baltimore, you have a PhD in conflict resolution. And I found myself confronted with adult master's students at Baltimore who are largely predominantly Black or immigrant, who have negotiated themselves and their lives all the way to grad school. And the questions that they came at me with, I had no idea how to answer. Because I had, first week, Wanda says, how do I get my kids back from the court? I have no idea. Right? How do I get my brother to stop using drugs before family dinner? How, as a 6'4", 280-pound Black man, can I not intimidate white people? And I was like, I have no idea. The books have no idea. And their needs were like pressing. Like, I need housing. Like, I need, what can, a white woman can say that, but not a Black woman. And so I was sort of confronted with my limitations and then the field's limitations. And it was sort of born out of humiliation of like, we need to write another book. So they helped me through 100 of them over times and edited it and their stories and like what were even the topics that would be different, right? I mean, they wanted to know a lot of things that they weren't corporate issues. They were really navigating not corporate context or legal context, but they were administrative offices and military. Like, oh, we want me to ask my boss for a raise in the military? Like, you think that's going to go well? So I was really confronted with an ethical question. of how to teach negotiation, take the best of what we know from negotiation training, make it accessible to more people who like really need this stuff, but also how to, this is the other piece, that when you get into power, how do you not replicate those systems of oppression that marginalize people to begin with? And the other books didn't seem to have that kind of catch, that check to make sure that that didn't happen.
And it's interesting, I mean, you point out, one of the things I found fascinating is I think when we think about negotiation, we presume the interaction of rational actors. And there are situations, for example, when you're dealing with someone who's a drug addict, where you're not dealing with a rational actor and sort of trying to figure out how do you navigate those kinds of situations.
Yeah, and so that was really interesting. And we brought in actually some recovering addicts and people to talk about that because, you know, at best, if you're negotiating with somebody who's an addict, you're negotiating with two people, the ones who did it and the one who doesn't want to be. But sometimes the person's only addicted and there's no negotiation. So we had to bring people in and say, how do you make anything happen? Can you? The one woman spent, Highland, she's in the book, she spent the whole semester trying to figure out how to get her brother to stop using drugs before family dinner and use the principles to have a family meeting and navigate through. So, yeah, that was the...
So, I mean, you touched on this a little bit, Ron, in terms of thinking about how, what's so interesting about Sarah's book is how it's so clear throughout how it involves her students in every step of the way. There's concrete examples, there's ways in which it affected her decision about what types of issues to address and so on. I think what's interesting about your book is you also find ways to bring reality into fiction, and as you point out, it's based on your own experiences. How does one tell a story that holds true to the reality of what it means to do war crimes investigation, while also trying to tell a compelling fictional story that doesn't go too Tom Clancy on you, that doesn't, you know, have somebody hanging outside of a helicopter, Tom Cruise outside of a helicopter, but still riveting story. How did you navigate that storytelling aspect?
Well, it's hard to do, but the thing that I was trying to do was to move forward a plot that had at its core a mystery, but as you say, you know, not to go too Tom Clancy. You can't do that. At the same time, the balance is you don't want to come out with a message explicitly. Like with Sarah's work, there are lessons at the end of every chapter, right? And you can't do that with fiction because then you become didactic. And if you've ever read a didactic novel, there's nothing worse. Right? So the message has to be oblique. It has to be something that the reader arrives at through the story and through the characters. Yeah. That's the basic difference that I found with this project against other things like academic writing.
And along the same lines, I mean, part of what you're trying to do, Sarah, is make this very complicated subject, one that's been studied, you know, in many different ways, more accessible. And I think part of the way that you're able to do that is to work through real people's experiences and present them in a compelling way. How did your students react to I mean, it's really just out. You're holding a copy of this book for the very first time, but they saw drafts. They participated in it. How did the real people involved in the production of this work, how did they experience it? How did they respond?
Yeah, I guess I will have to wait till once they see it in print, but they did. I hired a bunch of them to help me, like to edit the chapters and comment, and then I had them go through the chapters. I assigned all the chapters to the class and had them critique the chapters as part of the assignment, so that I got to say. And they're like, "Oh wait, you forgot this," or like, "Oh, that's not true," or "I have another story that my story is better. Use my story." You know, so they're like, there's a lot of that kind of jockeying in that way. But I think, and what I really hope for this book is that the students who get it see themselves and their lives as relevant to negotiation. Because the students really did their best to try to make, Getting to Yes and some of these other great books work, but they're just like as Matthias said one night, she's like, I'm sorry they're having trouble with their $1 million deal or whatever, but I'm trying to get Geico to give me my stolen car back. There's different problems, and everyone in the class is like, oh my god, I know. So it wasn't that the principles of the other books are wrong in any way. It's just that there was a lot of missing an opportunity to reach more people with negotiation.
And so I want to come back to the sort of quip I made about Florida, because I know both of you have worked, well, I didn't know about family in Florida, but I know that both of you are in different ways dealing with the politics of memory. And we are at a moment in our existence as a country where we are not comfortable with the politics of memory. We are literally seeing people try to suppress memory.
Yeah.
Even as some people are becoming awoken to memory. And I'm really curious, on the one hand, how, particularly you, Ron, as someone who is a memory seeker and has worked to try to dredge up some of the unpleasant memories of the past in order to, again, create a consciousness around them in society today, how you view this current moment. And I'm also curious, in Sarah's case, having done some work on this as well, how do we negotiate that? How are we going to get to yes on the fact of history, right? How do we get people to be literally on the same page in our school books about what happened in our past? Because it's an incredibly, memory can be an incredibly selective thing. And confronting difficult experiences and memories is something nobody really wants to do. We all, to some degree, in our personal experiences, are I mean, my recollection of my own conduct is immaculate, right? But how do we deal with this, particularly at this very important moment as we're trying to document things that have happened in the recent past, things that have happened in our distant past, and come to agreement as a society about what's happened and what's right.
Want to go first?
No, go ahead, because
Yeah.
it's more the memory first with yours,
Sure.
and I'll
Okay.
build up.
So one of the things that I'm seeing happen through this sometimes repression of memory or trying to present a version of history that suits a particular identity or a particular political agenda. It's something that similar to what I've once referred to as therapeutic history. And that is an approach to the past in which the criteria of the truth is how it makes you feel. And if it makes you feel good, then it's true, right? If it affirms something that you want, then it's true. But when you do that, you're having to distort the past, because the memories that are those that you're looking for to gain leverage, for example, in a war crimes investigation, they're uncomfortable. The aftermath of conflict is uncomfortable. It's full of compromise. It's full of decisions that could have been made otherwise. It's full of mistakes. It's full of, collaborations that sort of happen by slow accretions. And on a mass scale sometimes too, right? It's very, very, very uncomfortable. And when you're trying to look at a national history or a history of a people, it becomes important to allow that discomfort. I think it becomes very important not to allow oneself collectively or individually to base the truth on what feels good, what helps you to recover from the difficulties of the past.
And that actually prepares you more to deal with life as it is. Because the therapeutic story is a story that didn't happen, and it moves you in a direction from a conflict perspective, since I'm it makes you want to solve the conflict in a way that you feel that way. Again, but that's not possible. That's dream justice. That's not happening. You're not going there. So the therapeutic approach to the world leaves you really unprepared to navigate life as it is, these challenges. I wanted to write a book that, we have a lot of books, some of which we've both written about the problems and the challenges. And there's a lot of books about how to change your life and make everything great. But I never saw those books sort of come together in a way that acknowledged the problems, but also to map a line of path out. So you can actually find a way. So that was sort of what I was trying to do in this book, is say, here's what's actually happening. Here's all the places we're stuck, but here's how you can still move anyway. So that was sort of a way forward. But for the memory, there is the one is, just to draw on that, because this relates more to my last book, but the single story will never work. Like none of us are all gonna agree, even what has happened in the past 20 minutes, right? We're gonna have totally different versions. And so the last book I was saying, well, what did the French Railway do? How is it a victim during the war? How is it a hero? And how is it a perpetrator? There are 3 different ways you can read the story, and you can do something called narrative braiding. Like yes, and yes, and yes. Now, like, was slavery teaching people, skills they could use? Like, was it displacement? No, right? Like, there's like some clear distortions. But if you take the strong person argument of a lot of these things, you can find there are narrative threads that we can say they sit next to each other. So that's what we've tried to do in some of our work. And people who lived through it know that.
And I mean, building on that a little bit, as you point out, we're not coming to our experiences with the same perspectives.
Right.
And can you talk a little bit about, because you talk about the way that our own individual roles affects our interactions in a negotiation in important ways, that where there are different power dynamics, different even just sort of priorities or sensibilities.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was also kind of missing in some of the negotiation books, is I noticed that all my students, they either felt too young, too old, too black, too white, too big, too small. Like, I don't know who the perfect person was, but nobody was the perfect person. So that was sort of interesting. Everybody was conscientious of where they fell short or what they felt they should be. One was to talk about that in class and actually say, okay, so what do you think are your liabilities? Also, what I discovered is that the people who impose the biases on you may look just like you. That it wasn't just, white, but it was black managers also telling black employees that they shouldn't be asking for more. It was white women being really hard on white women. We really saw that, and that was sort of fun to unpack and have people share. But then how they navigate it. And I do think maybe it's not just an approach to sort of teaching, is having students coach each other. Oh, I've been through that, or I've run into that too, and navigate the power. The other challenge of teaching a truly diverse class is you can't tell, an Afghani student the same thing to how to navigate her family that you can tell a Protestant, student from Massachusetts. And teaching students from China versus Brazil, what they can say to their government for social change. The stakes were really different. So understanding your role, understanding what you feel that your liabilities are, but also what's the power structure that you're in. Like, there is no advice for all readers, because it can get one person shot in Baltimore. They're like, oh yeah, I can't say that. They're gonna be like, what stupid white person book are you reading? There's like things you just can't say. So just making that visible and giving space for people to talk about what they're experiencing.
So writing a book is a huge, monumental endeavor, and it's not something you do in the course of 3 weeks. It takes some time, and you invest an enormous amount of yourselves in this process. And in many ways, as you go through that process, you go through a process of change and sort of reflection and so on. How was writing each of these books transformative for the two of you, and in your growth as individuals, as scholars, sort of now that you're on the other side of having written these books, what are your takeaways from that experience?
Well, for me, this was a first foray into fiction writing, something that I long wanted to do. But so the first thing that I had to learn and was happy to learn and continue to learn was the difference between writing fiction and writing academic scholarship and
There were
storytelling.
not a lot of footnotes, I noticed, in this.
Not a lot of footnotes, no. And I had to really be careful about the language that I was using. I had to count syllables, take out the 4-syllable words that will, get you kudos in an academic book with some people, right? And find the simpler word, find the more poignant way to do it. Another part of it, though, was family discovery, exploring the dilemmas that a country faces in the aftermath of a mass atrocity, of an occupation, of a violent episode, and how that affects families, and how that affected my family in particular, and how that affected how I was raised. That was a process of discovery too. And then there's the north-south process of discovery. When I explored the aftermath of the civil war in Mali in 2012 to 13, which was the subject matter of the International Criminal Court's investigation, I saw so many parallels with the aftermath of the German occupation in the Netherlands, including what to do with women who had relationships and the control of women and the different standards by which you judge people for their complicity, and the mess that isn't often written about in terms of the post-war in Europe.
But it's interesting you bring up the North-South, because there's a different power dynamic, in a sense, in the story you tell about the Mali investigation and the one that is dealing with decades-old abuses by the SS. And there's even, one of the things I found really interesting was a point that someone made in the investigation of Mali is the main character is trying to sort out what's actually happening and why they're even there. The I don't want to give plot points away.
Yeah.
I don't want to spoil anything, but just the complexity of when an institution like the ICC, which didn't exist prior to Nuremberg, didn't exist to remedy World War II atrocities. When an entity like the ICC exists to be able to step in, and there are, in a country that is a developing country, et cetera, there are different ways that external power can be, can actually complicate sort of what's happening on the ground. And really raises questions about why are we holding some people to account and not others? And so I found that quite fascinating.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there is a different power dynamic. There were the allies that were present after World War II that, there was certainly a presence, but it wasn't as much a judicial presence. It wasn't a power presence, whereas the ICC really has been present in the global south, and especially in Africa. Now it's changing as it sort of gains reach and power, as we hope as I hope it does. But that's certainly the situation I grew up with.
Yeah, at first, as I said, I started writing this book because it was embarrassing to teach without something that spoke to what they went through. But what I learned was how good they were at negotiating. That actually they were amazing, and they discovered that too. And I thought, oh my gosh, if they can get through the middle class to the top, they are going to be amazing leaders, because for example, one of my students who worked in a correctional facility, she would have these tasks where she had to do a lot of something physical and have people screaming insults at her to see if she could finish. Right, that was her training. Like, I've never had that training. Right, so if somebody has a tantrum, I'm like, I don't know what to do. Right, she's like, I can work through anything. She's like, I raised 12 kids. Most of them weren't mine. They just could have showed up at my house and I raised them. And so I saw like this, not only this savviness, this ability to manage emotions in a way. I mean, in the C-suite, like teacups break. I mean, if you're going to work with like a Bill Gates, like you got to be ready, because like, or a Musk, or, you know, and it can be really tough up there. And if you've grown up in middle class civility, you're not ready for that. Their bullshit detectors were way higher than mine. Like, they're amazing. And so I think that shifted me. It's not just like they deserved a book, but like, whoa, we need to learn from them. I also started to see the blind spots in negotiation that didn't protect from just this idea of win-win, like we can win, but we can screw over everybody else not in this room. But their lives helped me see in their historic marginalization that we don't want to have negotiation just be that. And the larger sort of shift for me too is, you know, there's a lot of talk about white privilege and kind of giving other people privilege, but my realization in doing this and being in Baltimore is like, oh wait, I'm missing out on them. Like, it's really presented as like, we need to welcome them to us because we've got all the good stuff. And I was like, oh, no. They got a lot of the good stuff too. They got a lot of goods, and the communities were even much tighter. The way families took care of each other was tighter in different ways. So yeah, I had a lot of real and a real different growth for me around race in the United States that I wouldn't have had access to. Through doing this with them and getting some funding and paying them and being in this. So I'm curious to see how they respond once they see it. We'll see.
And do you feel like those kinds of lessons of what you can take away from the people you're trying to help think about negotiation? Do you, from the previous books that you've written, working with other communities outside the United States, do you find that you've taken similar kinds of lessons away there? It's interesting to me that you're like, we need to learn from them. What have you learned from other
I'm
groups?
so glad you asked that. Actually, I never made the connection, which was that, you know, you're going to need complicated heroes to get yourself out of a mess. And by that, I mean, you know, in mass atrocity, you end up in the aftermath working with people who committed atrocities to help rebuild the community. In Baltimore, if you want people to help with the city, you're going to need formerly street-involved people interrupting the violence. I can't go into the street and be like, you shouldn't shoot this guy, but like my students can. Like, and some of them have you know, done that and do that work because they have that credibility. So I think sometimes there is a desire to look for the hero that's going to come save the day. Oftentimes we found in our last book that those heroes were not pure the way we want to be. The Safe Streets workers in Baltimore who interrupt the violence end up selling drugs again and getting indicted because, as the director said, she's like, we're taking out basically alcoholics and putting them back in a bar. You're taking somebody formerly street involved, they have to pay alimony quick, they know how to do that in a minute, and you want them to not do that? And it's like, well, do you want them to not do that or stop the shooting? And they get shot. I mean, the risks are very high for them. So I think I've gained more, and through studying the Holocaust and other mass atrocities and that like, we don't need perfect people to help us move forward. And I think when we're trying to sort to good guy, bad guy, hero, we're really on the wrong track.
And this is my last question, because I've monopolized quite a bit of the time, but my last question is, it's very unique to, this is the first panel I think I've ever been on, as you said, where you two put these books together, you live in the same household. How did you influence each other in these books? Did you go off to separate corners of the house
during the COVID?
Right? Were you looking at each other's manuscripts as you went along and influencing? There's, I don't know if this is too much of a spoiler, but there is a romantic element to at least the fictional piece. I didn't find it as much in Transformative Negotiation, but like, how did as a couple writing books that could come out around the same time, how was that process negotiated?
Sarah, how does this sound?
There was no escaping it. I'm washing dishes. Let me just read you what I just wrote. I was like, oh, I couldn't like walk through the room. Wait, just let me sell this one thing. But then
I did the same thing.
With this one, with Ron's book, what was really fun is he would say something, and some of the dialogue is actually us, probably to some degree, or the character would do something off, and we'd be like, no, like, or some. We had to help with the woman character a little bit. She sometimes said things that were a little, so like a little coaching on some.
Great husband. That line got nixed.
Yeah, right.
It's
She's
true.
a dedicated. No, in this, like Ron had read maybe 4 or 5 versions of the book.
Right.
He's really good at copy editing too. I just miss words. Yeah, but it was COVID confinement. What else are you gonna do? You know, have breakfast, write books, go for a walk.
Yeah,
Have
that's
an
it.
aperitivo. Let's do it again.
Do it again.
Amazing. Well, I really enjoyed looking at both of these books. I really enjoyed reading both these books. Learned different things from them. And I don't know, did anyone here, no one else would have read, I think, your book, which is just out.
Right.
I don't know
Yeah.
if there's anyone who's had a chance to look at the Memory Seeker, if we have any of your students here, but I think we just want to open it up to questions and discussion from the audience. If you haven't read them, I highly encourage you to pick up both of these books and take a look. They're both fascinating, enjoyable reads, so kudos to both of the authors. Why don't we take a few questions?
I didn't read the books, but I want to. But what you both said, I'm a psychologist, and what you said about feeling good history, that really struck home. And what you said about the reality of people's stories instead of the theory, which is my struggle in my doctorate and my postdoc and my fellowship and all this. I'm going, well, this isn't. It's theoretically interesting behaviorism and this, but the reality of people's stories and the history of, and I'm a history major as well. So my question is this, so shut up, get to the point. Okay, my daughter's a math teacher, and I'm more theoretical, she likes the fact, succinct, so I'll try to be succinct. It's this, when I see a patient with so-called PTSD, and I'm supposed to make them feel better, and I do my best because I used to write music and I like, ideas, and give problem solving, make this person come up with some ideas to make their life better, feel better. But the reality is, if they have PTSD from something that maybe we shouldn't have been doing, or something they did, or something they saw, or something that was so disgusting, so riveting, so absolutely abhorrent, even in the policy that they're stuck in, on the ship or in the the group, or and they're telling me stuff, and once they get to know me and trust me, they're really telling me stuff that they don't trust the psychologist in the military for. And I'm finding it difficult to just see them as an individual person with a pathology of PTSD or a diagnosis of depression or generalized anxiety disorder. And I feel like saying, holy shit, they shouldn't have been having to do that in the first place. And who's deciding on all this money that's going now to fight China, and now a meeting with Japan and South Korea so we can fight China? Like, what the hell's going on? We can't fight China.
What is your question?
My question is, where do you get some reality when you're dealing with policy, huge mechanisms of war, of policy, of social policy that are, like when you sail,
Okay, stop.
How do you deal with the context?
Oh, yeah, no, but where do you,
Where do you start
well,
to deal with such big issues?
how
in
can
these
it be realistic if the individual mistake or sickness is not their fault? That's great.
Right. So I deal with this question in 2 ways in the Memory Seeker. One is the trauma of war that you're talking about, which seems senseless, and it isn't. We recognize the horror when we can see the images, but what you don't see in the images is the damage that people carry with them, which is variously called PTSD or post-traumatic stress syndrome. And that's something that you see as an investigator. But another thing that you see as an investigator is your own reaction to the images. So when I did my training on digital investigation of war crimes, one of the things you have to be aware of is the vicarious trauma that you get from watching images. And sometimes investigators have to go over an image again and again and again, and it's something you don't want to see. It's something that has been removed by content moderators because it's like disgusting. It's shocking, right? So you have to take special measures. You have to go for a walk in the woods. Sarah and I have a rule at home: no genocide after 8 o'clock. So it affects what we watch on Netflix. We're very careful about the kinds of images and ideas we're assimilating as we're dealing with the horror of war.
And with the negotiation was giving space that when students were having trouble speaking up for themselves, it wasn't because they didn't love themselves and they didn't have enough confidence. Like actually, they've been taught, and through generations of their family have been taught that they don't deserve. And so actually giving a space, and that's what I talk about, is helping them think through, why do they have trouble asking? Why do they give in particular ways? Like there are legacies that have to do with that aren't just personal, and that their pain and their not having isn't just personal failure, or their lack of networks, that they don't have a rich uncle, right, that's going to get them the job, like isn't a personal failing. So that's what I'm trying to do, is have them describe kind of structurally how they're stuck while moving forward with that, with those wounds. Yeah, that weren't all theirs.
Okay, and then back here again.
So Sarah, I'm envious of that classroom because I'm not a teacher. I kind of was, but anyway, but not really. So I'm envious of the classroom because of the diversity and the richness of history. Personal history, social history. Are you still in that environment anymore?
I am here, and you will see from my amazing students.
Huh?
No, I teach right in the Croc School here, over there, over there. First year, it's here. No, it's my second year. So I teach here.
So do you have that same richness of diversity that you
Yeah.
have in the city of Baltimore? Okay.
Yeah, really different. We come from really different backgrounds, right? Abid's from Pakistan.
From Pakistan, the northwestern part of Pakistan, which borders with Afghanistan. And we have a lot of other international students as well.
And even nationally, it's a really different. So one of the what's really amazing about students here is that they have a little more, because people in Baltimore were like, they're just they work all day, they take care of 3 people, and they come to, so they're like, what do you have for me now? And like today, I need a house tonight, And here the students they have this awareness because they've often either seen people suffer, traveled a lot, done work, and they have time to think about it in a different way and step back a little bit and reflect. So there's both are really rich
The
environments.
trauma exists for both. It's just that one of them is more ever present in their current life, and the other one has been ever present. And
That's right.
is still ever present here.
It's really true. Yeah.
For you, how do you negotiate with somebody who is so wedded to an alternative set of facts, particularly in the political environment in which we live right now?
Yeah. There's all kinds of different tactics of well, how did you arrive to that? One of the ones I've been playing with lately, which is so let's say that all plays out the way you want it to play out. Those people who are the problem are gone, wherever they are.
Right.
Tell me about that first day. You get up, you have something for breakfast, bagel, go for a walk, go to work. How was your day different? Map that out for me. And then what you start to see is a lot of things they want, they can have right now. And that eliminating the so-called other will not. Now, I don't know if these narratives are about the kind of eliminating, if we just get rid of those people, whoever those people are, or that way of seeing things. But tell me how that will be for you. And the other way, there's something called circular questioning, which is really useful, which is, okay, so let's say it's all resolved, we all agree with you, we're all on board. Tell me what's the first thing that would be different in your life? Take me down that. Because it's usually, and I'm studying polarization with some students this semester, I'm really excited, but some of the depth of the commitment to those ideas are not as deep as they seem. That they're very adamant, they are very dramatically presented, but they're actually thin. And the commitment to them will become greater if you go of them hard. So you do come sideways, and you're trying to move the person from the agitation, because they're in the amygdala, they're in the no binary, to being able to hold opposing ideas. Have you always felt this way? was there something that really shifted for you? Like, was there a moment when you felt like you had it and then you lost it? Or like a dream that you can't, like, and then if they get in the topography of their lives, they sort of dance off of the views that are speaking to the emotional pain that those views have just anchored onto.
I guess building on that question, that's how you approach it one-on-one.
Mhm.
How do we turn the volume down?
Yes, so this is
in
what
large groups.
our life's work, so yes. So we're having a class in May called Crossing the Divide. We're taking a train across the country to study conflicts across the country and just be curious about what different people, Jake's gonna help me do the Patagonia part in Arizona, mining issues, environment, indigenous, as well, and red and blue environment. So an openness, a curiosity with groups, studying polarization. One of the exciting things is that to know is that the loudest are the most polarized. There's a lot of people that you're not hearing from. They're like, I don't want to get in the middle of that. So I think for ourselves, like in consuming this, and we have a media expert, Nikki back there, who probably can tell us a lot more about this, but to watch how we're reacting to it and the image that we're getting, that we're divided, right? That story. What do you have to say? We talk about this a lot. Yeah, I know we all do.
Complex stories.
Yeah.
For me, one of the ways to break down binaries is fiction. Because when you're reading stories, you're introducing yourself to another way of seeing the world, someone else's vision, someone else's voice. Even language can introduce difference and complexity. So to me, that is one of the ways that I've personally felt that I'm addressing that issue.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I teach the State Department Foreign Service officers this, like how to not be pulled into the binaries of the large group conflicts where they find themselves pulled in. So we do another session on that. We'll train you all how to deactivate those.
Right.
Here's a familiar face.
Hey, I have a question around this conversation around polarization, memory, and politics of the past. How do you begin to inform the public? Because it seems so much of our education, public history, has been narrated in such a way where we have an official record set forth. And when that official record gets exposed with its fragilities, there's more information. We come to recognize that the past is a phenomenon and history is a story. And we never question who are our storytellers. And I think we get caught up in the fact that the story is changing, but we never question why do we have a limited amount of storytellers telling the official record in the first place. So I wanted to see if you could speak to that. And then secondly, how do we also negotiate that we don't know the past? We're still trying to understand the past by telling these stories, by retrying to opening up what we know from it versus based upon the artifacts that we can get from it. And that we all have somewhat of bias towards certain stories. If you're more intellectually inclined, you might listen to an academic telling that story. If you're more sort of folkloric, you might listen to an everyday person tell that story. So how do we begin to realize that we're kind of imprisoned by our own world?
I have one thought. I just reading the scientific study that people prefer physical pain to uncertainty. Wow. It's just hit me once. Don't leave me in a year, election year 2024. I'll take just one clock to the jaw, and I'm like, just tell me how it's going to end. And to Matthew does a lot of good work around storytelling and helping us kind of understand who we are as we move towards the 250th anniversary of the country, is that more stories make more people uncomfortable. Because it's such a complicated world. Just give me something. Like, I just got to know who the good guys, who are the bad guys. And how then do we help people, and this is the work I think you're doing, right, is helping people hold the less therapeutic version of the story, the cognitive dissonance. But how do we increase our comfort with uncertainty?
Right.
Like Hillary.
Yeah. And this is a good place to end. I think we're down. To me, storytelling is essential. This is one of the motivations for me to get into fiction writing, was the idea that we can do this too. Scholars can involve themselves in telling something other than the the terrible stories they're writing for peer-reviewed journals, and actually doing something that will reach people and offer something that doesn't necessarily, smooth everything out and give them definite answers, but offers another perspective, another possibility, another voice, and another pathway towards being comfortable with the dissonance that's naturally part of our lives.
I think we are out of time, so I just want to say, first of all, thank you to all of you for being here and for such engaging questions, but also, most importantly, to Ron Eisen for sharing with us a little bit about his book, The Memory Seeker, and Sarah Fetterman for sharing about her book on transformative negotiation.
Thanks for coming.
Autographed copies.
And advice on how to
Yeah.
negotiate with your family.
Yeah.